Did the Formula One treatment work on NASCAR? Let's chat about it. If you're new here, my name is Taylor Kitchen, and this is Above the Yellow Line, where we do motorsports media your way, talking about NASCAR literally all the time. If you're watching this video, you've either already seen Full Speed, NASCAR's Netflix docuseries, or you haven't seen it yet, so spoilers ahead, I will be talking about this in detail. But before I do that, make sure to like this video and make sure you're subscribed to our channel, and also make sure to comment your thoughts below. Without further ado though, let's get to it. Let's start off by saying this is what I've been waiting for. This series presented the sport in such a positive, badass, and cool light that I don't think we've seen with other docuseries or documentary style things that have been done with the sport. I know we had Race for the Championship, and that was kind of the shell, or I guess the foundation for what Full Speed is. And as somebody who works in the industry, behind the scenes, in front of the camera, and as somebody who is also a fan, I felt this portrayed our sport accurately. Nothing was over dramatized, nothing was blown out of proportion. This all felt grounded and accurate, which I really appreciated. So those are my initial thoughts, but let's dive a little deeper, talking about the personalities that Full Speed covered. We've been wondering and begging NASCAR and these drivers to give us more, show us more of who you are. And when you have a series like this, you know you're gonna get that. It's just to what extent? And Netflix did a really good job pulling back the curtain and showing us who these drivers, who these personalities within the sport are outside of the racetrack. We got to see how they interact with their family and friends. We also got to see the highs and the lows of racing, what it's like to lose, how that really affects you. We got to see the highs of winning a race and the behind the scenes emotions of that. We also got to see really good driver-fan interactions, like Denny Hamlin officiating or legalizing a marriage between two of his fans at the racetrack, which was bizarre, but really funny. And we got to see Ross Chastain go out of his way to meet one of his fans in the infield that he saw had a blow up watermelon, and he took the time to talk with him. And that just goes to show the character of these drivers, their willingness to go out of their way for their fans. It also shows how much access NASCAR has as opposed to other sports. And I know we have this whole debate that NASCAR has less access than IMSA and IndyCar, and I do believe that still. I did a whole video on that, but as compared to other really big motorsports, I think NASCAR does a fantastic job with fan driver access. So when talking about the personalities, I really do think that NASCAR followed the right storylines. There are some that they missed out on, and we'll talk about that in a second, but let's talk about the key players to Full Speed. The biggest complaint that I've heard across the board is that this is the Denny Hamlin show. It follows Denny way too much. It doesn't make sense. Why? And I hear you. I understand where you're coming from. However, this series would not be as good as it is if it didn't have him as involved as he was, and here's why. Hamlin was one of the most talked about drivers this past season, for better or for worse, and he has his hand in so many pots from the driver standpoint, the driver team owner standpoint. That's a huge storyline, and how that impacts him and his championship hopes when he's worried about his two drivers that are also in the playoffs. And because of that, we had Bubba Wallace and Tyler Reddick, who were also pretty big main characters in this docuseries. Denny Hamlin's also a media member with his podcast Actions Detrimental. So not only is Denny Hamlin the narrative, he's made a lot of the narrative this season, and therefore is a very critical part in fans understanding the sport. And because he's put his narrative out there, and because he's controlled it, kind of what you see is what you get with Denny. And that's exactly what this NASCAR docuseries showed. And even then, they pulled back the curtains a little bit more on Denny Hamlin and his social media presence to go into his personal life with his family, with his daughters, with his parents. His interview with his dad literally almost made me cry, like just seeing the pride that his dad has in him and the journey that they've all been on to get to where he is. And if you're a newer fan that doesn't know Denny's story, you probably felt really bad or really sorry or really disappointed when he didn't make the championship four, because they pulled back the layers on Denny Hamlin and showed you the core of who he is. And I think too, a lot of people that watch NASCAR on a regular basis and maybe don't like Denny Hamlin at least have a new appreciation for him through this docuseries. So I think showing Denny Hamlin in this way, though it might have been annoying to some, I also think was necessary. We also followed Ross Chastain, and yet again, looking back at his season in 2023 and his playoffs, kind of wasn't a main character, but I feel it was important that Netflix showed him because of the Hail Melon move. He was the one that put NASCAR back in national headlines. So this really does link those that maybe don't watch NASCAR on a regular basis to something that they know with Ross Chastain. So that's why I think he was followed so much in this docuseries. And in that case, I think it makes sense, even though, again, his series was kind of lackluster. Then we get to the Championship 4, and I will say this is where I have some of my critiques of the show. I feel Netflix did a really good job showing us who Ryan Blaney is. Inside the car, a hothead, short-tempered, aggressive, but also a masterclass driver, and who he is outside of the car, which is kind of a grounded, down-to-earth guy. Really likable guy. And I think they did a great job showing us who Christopher Bell and who William Byron are. Drivers that I would otherwise think are pretty bland. Just putting that out there very blatantly. They are drivers that I really do see as bland and have minimal personality. But NASCAR said, step aside, let us pull back the curtains and show you who they are. And I think they did a great job. The critique comes in here. I think we saw a lot of William Byron and Ryan Blaney, but we didn't really get to know who Christopher Bell was, or even Kyle Larson, 2 of the 4 Championship 4, until the last 2 episodes of this series. And I think a lot of that has to do with this story. The full speed story is told in chronological order. Christopher Bell, though he had a pretty decent start to the playoffs, didn't get hot until halfway through, until the end. Kyle Larson, though, he was consistent, so I was kind of shocked that he didn't really have more of a story earlier on. But I think some of my favorite moments in the show were actually with Christopher Bell. I think he, of all of these drivers, is the one that we really just don't know a whole lot about in terms of personality and who he is off the track. And it was so iconic when the Netflix producer basically told him, hey, we had plans going into this whole series of who we were going to follow, all of this and whatnot. And then Christopher Bell just goes, I wasn't in that plan, was I? And the producer just goes, yeah, you weren't in that plan. And Christopher Bell goes, imagine that. Like, that's gold. Like, those are golden reactions of personality that you can and will get out of Christopher Bell. And he is one of the most underrated talents in this sport right now. He is so good at what he does. He's a very likable driver as well. So I really do think this series elevated him in the way that he needed to be elevated. And I think from this, will gain and hopefully should gain a lot of new fans. As for the drivers, I'm shocked they didn't follow, but also understand as to why. Kevin Harvick, this was his last season as a driver before he joins the Fox broadcast booth. I understand not wanting to show your audience a driver who's just about to retire because they're not going to be able to follow his career. I get that. Also, Kevin Harvick's season was not the greatest, so I understand why he wasn't followed as much, or honestly at all. The only time we heard him talk was in episode 2. Kyle Busch wasn't really a factor in the playoffs, and he wasn't talked about really at all, except named by other drivers within the series, but we didn't hear anything from him. And I think the biggest disappointment for me, for one reason or another, RFK was not covered in this docuseries, and they had such good momentum going into the playoffs, so I don't know why. I would assume maybe the team didn't want to be involved, or again, I don't want to speak for why this happened or whatever, but their story this season, being the Cinderella story of a team, was so compelling, I struggle to understand why they weren't covered in this series at all. So if there's a season 2, and we'll talk about, what we hope the future is for this, hopefully they do decide to be part of this, or whatever happened. I mean, RFK, I would love to see Brad and Chris Buescher in this in some way, shape, or form. The last part of this critique or review is the behind the scenes that the fans get to see with this full speed series. I think when you cover the NASCAR season, the most interesting pieces of it are the races just before the playoffs and the playoff races. That's where things are the most intense. That's where the points really do truly matter. They matter all season, but you don't realize how much they do until it is crunch time. And for those who usually don't watch NASCAR, I think this was the most dramatic piece of time that you could have showed your fans. But altogether, though, it was a really good bite-sized idea of how much work and how much effort goes into racing. It's not just turning left. You get to see the strategy and the effort that goes behind these calls and these races. You get to see how hard these drivers have to train to be in peak physical shape to race in these cars. What I loved about this series too is it didn't just focus on the drivers, it also focused on the people that make these drivers successful, the crew chiefs, the pit crew, the team owners. In particular, I loved the coverage that Booty Barker got. Seeing his personality and seeing how him and Bubba Wallace's relationship works, to me, was very interesting. And something else I found interesting too, as somebody who, again, works in the sport but also watches it as a fan, I saw things in this docuseries that otherwise I haven't seen before. We know that the drivers have these manufacturer meetings before super speedway races, and this series actually showed what that looks like, what the conversation kind of revolves around, how things are worded. And again, though this series is kind of pointed towards, and mostly pointed towards, newer fans that otherwise maybe have never seen NASCAR or have watched it very minimally, there was also things for the longtime fan as well, which I really appreciated. With all of that said, what is the future for NASCAR and Netflix? Right now, as pointed out by Jeff Gluck, Full Speed is the 5th most popular TV show in the US on Netflix's platform. And that is in its first full day on Netflix, which I think is pretty good and I think exceeds or I guess balances out what my expectations were. Did I think this series would be a global success? Well, if we're comparing it to Drive to Survive, Formula One is a global racing series. NASCAR is not. We used to do some racing outside of the US. We haven't done it in years. Hopefully we're moving towards that direction again. But in terms of what I thought this would do, I at least was hoping it would be a hit in the United States, and it ranking in the top 10, I think that's a win for us. With that said, the one thing I am incredibly curious about with this series is how many people that watched this were first-time fans. And by that I mean not somebody like me who either works in the sport, watches the sport on a weekly basis, watches races on the off-season just to fill that void. How many folks watched Full Speed who otherwise would not have given NASCAR the time of day? Because that's going to tell me how impactful Full Speed was to get newer fans into the sport. So if there's numbers on that, I'd love to see them. If there's not, fine, but I really do hope that this does have a lasting effect on a newer generation of fans, getting people into the sport through getting NASCAR on a global scale with Netflix. And depending on that and who viewed it and how well this did numbers-wise, I do think that we should have a season 2 of this. Now the question is though, do we expand to cover more races? Do we cover a full season? And I say let's not cover a full season because again, the races just before the playoffs and the races in the playoffs are the most interesting time of the NASCAR season that I think a general viewer of a series like Full Speed is going to care about. So I think covering the same thing, the same time frame is really important. Maybe expand it to maybe 2 or 3 races more before the playoffs. So I think having a season 2 would be really beneficial, especially if we have a lot more new drivers in the playoffs this year as opposed to last year. I think one story that we were really missing, which I think for better or worse, was Chase Elliott. NASCAR's most popular driver, really not covered at all because he did not make the playoffs this year. I think that came out of benefit to the other drivers having their stories shown without being really overshadowed, but also at a detriment because again, Chase Elliott is NASCAR's most popular driver, and the fans that are just watching this for the first time and getting exposed to NASCAR for the first time don't know that. So again, it's a pro and it's a con in my eyes. Last thing I will say is, though it will not be on the Netflix scale, I do hope that the Xfinity series gets the same type of treatment. Maybe the CW sees this docuseries Full Speed and is like, okay, we can do something similar with Xfinity. I would love to see that. And I think there are a lot of stories within the Xfinity series with the drivers and teams that are worth sharing, especially because there is a lot at stake in the Xfinity series. A lot of drivers are trying to elevate their career to the cup level. A lot of these drivers really do struggle with funding. There are a lot more smaller teams in Xfinity. So I think having a series like Full Speed for the Xfinity series would be awesome to watch. But again, that is me thinking way far ahead and past what we're talking about right now. Overall, though, I think Full Speed was excellent for the sport. It makes me proud to be part of this sport, as I think Netflix did a fantastic job portraying our sport in a very realistic but badass way. But what did you think of Full Speed? Let me know in the comments below, and to keep up to date with the latest NASCAR news, make sure to go to TobyChristie.com and AboveTheYellowLine.com. You'll also find our social media links over there. Make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and thank you all so much for supporting this episode of Above the Yellow Line. Until next time, I'll see ya. Bye.